Classic Restos is proudly brought to you by Shannons Insurance, where you can be a member of the Shannons Club. Pace Farm, the enjoyable egg. Hare and Forbes Machinery House. And Gun Lake Quarries.
It's not every day that you get a chance to get up close and personal with race heritage classics. Well, you're about to be on this week's episode of Classic Restos. The mid-1980s became an interesting time for motorsports. It was a time when the six-cylinder BMW held its own against the relatively underpowered V8 Mustang. Here is one factory car that BMW racing was based on.
This car behind me is a 1985 M635 CSi. They're an E24 BMW, the E24 platform. I stumbled across the car inadvertently. I'd already bought a 1983 E21, and I did notice it was actually in one of our auctions. So I was walking through the showroom and had a look at the car. Being fairly versed in a good vehicle, I thought, geez, this car's really nice. It's clean, tidy, honest, etc. So I just kept my eye on it, and I think through the day, that day I saw it, I thought I better go down and talk to the guys, see what it's all about. It was going in the next auction. So one of our auctions in Sydney progressed and the car passed in. A little bit after that, I went back to the guys in the office and said, look, can somebody contact the owner and see what he's going to do with it? And time ticked over, and the car had to move because the new auction was starting to evolve, and they needed to move the new cars in, etc. So, long story short, they pestered him for me a little bit, and I threw an offer at him, and it took a little while, but eventually the guy that owned it let the car go. So it was one of those after auction situations, and I'm lucky enough to be custodian. It's a fabulous car here. In Germany, they built 524 right-hand drive E24 M635 CSi's. That then followed into distribution around different parts of the world, but predominantly in the UK. Now, that also led to the touring cars being built. In Europe itself, there was a lot of racing, a lot of 635s were used. They were a slightly different platform, I think from memory, an RA chassis. Then those cars found their way to Australia via Frank Gardiner and Jim Richards and the pedigree that people remember from the racetrack with the black 6 Series coupes. And there was a lot of head-to-head racing. They were fast, they handled, they stopped, very nimble car, which is one of the big things I love about this car here. It's a fantastic car to drive. It's amazing for its age. The power of these six-cylinder Bosch 6-pot injected cars eclipsed the V8s a little bit. Some of the V8s were quite underpowered at times, depending on which cars that were racing at the time in particular. But it made for some very interesting racing. A lot of head-to-head, passing, cornering, etc. And there's footage around that people could probably already read and seen. There's so many different features to the car, but one of the big things I love about it is Recaro were involved in the BMW seating arrangements and whatnot back in the day, and the factory put the cars out with comfort but sports feel in the models that took on those interiors, and this car here got one of those interiors factory naturally, being the sport car. So the Getrag gearbox, along with that, the way that you're positioned at the steering wheel and with that stick throw, and it's just a fabulous car to drive. The way it handles, I've got strut braces front and rear, Bilstein B6 suspension, M-spec springs, big brakes. Amazing, to be honest. It's a very different experience. So I don't get a chance to get interviewed by Tony Barber, but I do get interviewed by Fletch. So I'm sure most people that watch this will remember the showcase on Sale of the Century. Well, that kind of is where the BMW logo stuck in my mind when I was very young. And naturally, as the years progressed, you know, learning of the race cars and seeing the iconic JPS livery was a huge thing. And along with all the Aussie cars and the V8s and everything, I loved them all, but they just stuck right etched into your brain. That JPS livery, I think, was the thing. And again, like I said earlier, I'm very, very fortunate to be custodian of this car, but some of the comforts of it are amazing, but the rawness and the handling characteristics really eclipse the whole thing. Once you start driving it, it is a different driving experience. 3.5, 6-pot injected, twin cam engine, a really, really big 6-cylinder for a car like this, 286 horsepower factory, beautiful Getrag 5-speed. They did come with a dogleg gearbox, which was the race box, but luckily this car's got the road gearbox in it, which is much, much nicer to drive. This car has a sunroof. The sunroof I could do without, but it was a very, very popular option on those cars back in the day, so a lot of them got the sunroof. And another thing with this car that's a little bit unique is that it's got the cloth interior with its anthracite interior. Most of them were leather, and it's also got no air conditioning option. So I love that about the car. It's a solid black, not a metallic. The cars, to me, was sold as they were supposed to be sold, as a nimble driver's car. You know, all of us as motor enthusiasts, we love the driving experience, I guess, and also the get-togethers and the coffee mornings and the car shows, which are huge in all parts of Australia. But that's what I love about my 1985 M635.
I knew she was the one. The heart's going a million miles an hour, the mouth's dry. It's love, mate. Pure and simple. In '71, this was the fastest four-door car in the world. Back then, you could pick one up for a bit over $4,000. Insurance, it's got to be Shannons.
No one knows your passion like Shannons. And with our multi-vehicle discount, you can even cover your daily drive. So call Shannons on 13 46 46. Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts.
Hare and Forbes Machinery House has been family owned and operated for over 85 years, and it's easy to see why. Planning on welding? Look at these welding tables and clamps, air compressors and different air tools, sandblasting cabinets, through to spray guns. Everyone is welcome at Machinery House. There are competitive freight rates around Australia, and you can buy online at machineryhouse.com.au. So remember, Hare and Forbes has the range. Michael, great to see you again. Nice car.
Thank you very much, Fletch. It's really good to see you.
The stance of the car looks good. Nice rubber around. It's got a good set of boots on it.
Yeah, it's actually, it's got a fair size a set of hoops, if you want to call it that. Yeah.
Standard back in 85, how wide was the rubber then?
16 by 8. They were actually a metric rim, to be honest. 415 millimetre. That's the way they came from factory. So quite unusual. You can still buy rubber for them, but it's deathly expensive, unfortunately. So a lot of them found aftermarket rims like I've got here. But these are an MK Motorsport German rim. So that's nice. They fit the car. They've made for it. So.
Awesome score, the car. There's no doubt about it. And to see the original Euro plates behind the historics as well, that's another little bit of coolness here today.
Yeah, it's always a bit of a difficult one fitting the H plate onto the vehicle. So I already had a Perspex Pommy plate on it already.
I reckon they should have made them longer, to be honest.
Well, yeah, they're pretty small. A little bit painful at times, but look, it fits the best, and I didn't want to put any weird looking brackets or, so yeah, that's what we ended up with.
Now, Michael, with the sunroof, did a lot of them come with that?
Yeah, they did. There was quite a lot of sunroof option cars in the E24 6 Series. It's actually quite difficult to get one without one.
Good on you, Michael. Now, on that note, I want to thank you for bringing this beautiful Beamer along here today to feature on today's show. Also, as well, there have been some episodes produced very recently up to New England, up to Kyogle, and here in Newcastle. You were an integral part of opening a door to meet some of these people around Central West and New South Wales, which we really do appreciate. So on that note, mate, thanks again, Michael, for all your cooperation there.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Finding the right people and the good people out in the motor enthusiast space is fantastic, and there's just so much tucked away in the sheds, isn't there? So, mate, it's a pleasure. Yeah.
Going to a place like Muswellbrook and meeting Cole and meeting some of the car club members there, going to Tamworth and Jason opening the door there with the Roadrunners, all these car clubs in our regional areas. There's a lot of them out there, and we'll continue to do this and meet different ones. And of course the car club directory on the Shannons Club as well. Very extensive there. Yeah,
it is, and there's so many years behind all that information. I've had 14 years with the company, it's been fantastic, and the amount of depth in the car club directory, as you said, there's lots and lots of clubs out there. I mean, there's 70, 80, 90 up in my area here, so it's full on. Yeah,
fantastic, mate. Michael, thanks again, mate.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, mate. Thank you, Fletch.
As with most of these cars, there's always quite a detailed background story as to how I acquired it. It all started where my motorsport journey was with Porsche 996, 997 GT3 Cup cars. I'd had the opportunity to drive a Ferrari 458 GT3 in the States, and I'd sort of had a little bit of a break from playing with race cars due to business commitments, and it got to that point where I thought, hey, it's time to step back behind the wheel, pull the helmet on and go and have a skid again. And I was sort of going to go down the path of GT3 once again with sports cars, but a chance conversation with a good friend of mine, Jason Matthews, in Queensland, who looks after a number of historic race cars, said, hey, why don't you consider a historic? And of course, none of these cars ever just pop up on Facebook Marketplace or Gumtree. These cars tend to be placed. So it was like, well, where do I start? So I was handed a phone number of a gentleman by the name of Chad Parrish, who is one of Australia's most connected brokers for finding and buying and selling these sorts of vehicles. So a conversation was struck up, and originally I was looking for a Ford Sierra RS500, but as luck would have it, at the time, Greens-Tuf came up on the market. It was also, though, conditional upon the previous owner, Terry Lawler, doing a deal on a DJR Ford Sierra, which he ended up acquiring. So I literally had a phone call and was told by Chad, if you want the car, drop what you're doing and go and do the deal, which I did, and it was done just as simply as that. Actually owning these cars is a bit of a loose description. I tend to think of myself as a custodian of a very important piece of Australian motorsport history. So actually owning this car and having it here in my personal collection, which I do have a number of cars, including a V8 supercar of note, is that it's having that particular iconic car that was very much a part of my youth in my possession, and being able to sit in that car and have the privilege of owning it is something quite special, because I myself have been to Bathurst every year since I was 13 years of age in 1987. And of course, that car, despite being a Peter Brock fan, was something which I had as a big poster on my wall as a young bloke. So to actually own that and the Young Lions supercar is a real honour and a privilege. Yeah, there's often a pinch yourself moment when you wander into your shed and actually, in a quiet moment, just take it in and consider what you actually have in your possession, which is one of your heroes' cars, and it's yours. The introduction of the Mustang, of course, happened in 1985, which was when Australia was introduced to a new international formula, which was Group A, which of course replaced the previous Group C touring cars that we'd all become to know and love. They were all affectionately known as the Big Bangers. In 1985, though, we went to an international formula, which was Group A. That enabled the local cars, being the Commodore, to be able to fight with the international exotic stuff that we'd never really seen a lot of previously. We'd only had bits and pieces, and it was dominated by our Australian Fords and Holdens, of course, as the Falcon and the Commodore. That all changed. Once we went to 1985, unfortunately Ford Australia never saw future in homologating a Ford Falcon. A V8 was unavailable, so Dick Johnson had to, in order to continue with a Ford product, jump into the Mustang. And this car actually, as a surprise to most people, has international heritage because it was originally built by Zack Speed, which most people know of the Formula One ilk. In Europe, it was run by Klaus Niedwitz in a couple of select rounds there in Germany before coming to Australia to be tested by Dick Johnson in 1984, which was the last year of the Group C touring cars, as an invitational car, and it ran as car 71. It was white at the time, and that was to just have a toe in the water to see how that thing would be as an introduction to Group A in 1985. One of the problems with the Mustang was the fact that it was well renowned to be somewhat underpowered back in period. It was also therefore competing with a whole bunch of other cars, including the Volvo 240 Turbo, which was driven very well by Robbie Francevic, and then later on John Bowe. The Ford Sierra that came on later was the replacement for this vehicle. So this became a stopgap vehicle until the introduction of the Sierra Cosworth, which happened in 1987. The problem is that the vehicle unfortunately was somewhat underpowered. So with the way that the rules worked at the time, it was very much competing head to head with a 635 BMW, which ultimately Jim Richards drove to victory in the Touring Car Championship, and the Mustang was the runner-up to that vehicle in 1985. The Mustang is powered by a 302 Windsor engine. It's carburettor fed, so it was relatively simple and easy as a transition for Dick Johnson back in the day, not having to deal with what they all affectionately referred to as computer chip technology, because it was somewhat rudimentary and not like what it is today. The vehicle is very simple in that regard. It was making around about 287 horsepower when it came from Zack Speed, which was very disappointing, but was developed mainly by Mick Webb, who was the engine developer at the time, to somewhat more power than that. It also goes back through a Getrag 5-speed gearbox, which is a synchromesh gearbox, not a crash gearbox or a dog engagement box like in the current supercars. And then, of course, the Achilles heel, unfortunately, with this vehicle is the rear differential. It is a Atlas differential, which most people would know as coming out of a V6 Capri. It is quite highly modified. However, it is somewhat fragile. It's got a number of ratios that were homologated at the time, obviously some taller ratios for circuits like Bathurst, down to some very low gearing that they used at Amaru Park and Oran Park in the day. Whilst everyone tends to focus upon the lack of power, one of the big features of this particular car was its handling and stopping, which was really up there with some of the very best in period. If you have a look at the car, it has a lot of mechanical grip with a lot of tyre under it. It's got very, very good brakes. It only weighs 1,325 kilos. So in terms of power to weight, it's an extremely impressive car to drive, and something that when you read Dick Johnson's biography, is it does say that essentially it's one of the better handling cars that he'd ever driven. It's an absolute honour and a privilege to own such an iconic piece of motorsport history that's been driven by a number of the absolute legends of the sport. Some people forget that Alan Moffat actually drove that car for 7 laps as a promotional piece for Channel 7 back in 1985. We have the late great Greg Hansford drove that vehicle. Larry Perkins, it was the only time he didn't drive a Holden in Australian Touring Car Championship history, and of course the legend himself, Dick Johnson, drove that car. And for me to be able to have the privilege of occupying the driver's seat on occasions is an unbelievable experience.
My passion for cars began when Nana and Pop bought their new Toyota Crown. It was Nana's, really. She loved that car. We went everywhere in it. My passion now is just the same, even though my cars are a little different. I've still got Nana's car, couldn't part with it. And I reckon if she was here today, she'd be insured with Shannons too.
Call Shannons on 13 46 46. Shannons, insurance for motoring enthusiasts.
And if you've got a classic, it just has to be insured with Shannons. Why not pick up the phone and give Shannons a call for a quote and a chat on 134646. And keep in mind that the Shannons Club is awaiting you. For more information, visit shannons.com.au.
The car behind me here is a 1994 Nissan R32 GTR V-Spec 2. It's one of around 1,200 that were originally built, and it's also a nod to the Group A era of motorsport, which I'm very fond of. Unfortunately, I was unable to afford or buy or locate a genuine Group A race car, so this is the next best thing. This particular car I imported myself for a very good client of mine who is now getting on in years and essentially had to rationalise his collection of cars, so it came back into my possession. The car is very original. It's done about 90,000 kilometres and original all the way right down to the exhaust, to the original wheels, brakes, tyres, the whole box and dice. So yeah, very, very interesting car and something that is becoming very much popular on the world stage. Now I know that the traditional audience for classic Restos is more about chrome and chrome bumper bars, and this doesn't necessarily appeal to everyone, but these are what we would probably think of as a modern classic, and will be certainly something that will be looked back on perhaps fondly with some and perhaps not so with others, because it tended to be somewhat of a polarising vehicle back in period, especially when it was racing in Group A. Most people possibly remember certain Jim Richards saying a certain thing that started with A's about the fans at the time when they won in 1992. That was the end of the Group A era. There were a very, very advanced car for their time, 2.6 litre, straight 6-cylinder, twin turbo, double overhead cam, 4 valve per cylinder, very powerful, made a lot of torque. Obviously a lot of the aftermarket fraternity modified them and made up to 1,000 horsepower in drag racing applications. What was probably the thing that set them apart from everything else and was all-conquering in motorsport in the era was the fact that they had an all-wheel drive system that was predominantly their rear-wheel drive that was then transferred torque to the front wheels as required, so that you got the best of both worlds. Not just constant four-wheel drive, but had the handling characteristics of a rear-wheel drive car, but also the four-wheel drive traction when it was needed, which was what obviously made it so dominating on the circuit and also now makes it such a fantastic road car even 30 years down the track.
Brad, what a cool collection you have. Having this Mustang, that just must mean so much to you.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, it's an honour and a privilege to be the custodian of such an amazing piece of equipment in motorsport history.
The affiliation, is Dick Johnson the man himself? Is he impressive? You got this car or what?
Oh, absolutely. But again, it sort of stemmed from childhood, you know, like all of those guys, they're icons, and to sort of be able to own them, but not just own them and drive them, is just an amazing thing.
I think it's an incredible era too. The spec of the BMW came up, the 6-cylinder was making some fantastic power. The V8s in this era started going downwards. Talk about head-to-head on racing.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, I'd argue and say there was some of the best motorsport that this country's ever seen, but not just this country, but it sort of put us on the world stage with Group A, yes.
And we move on through, and as we've seen today as well, the Godzilla. Now, a stock car, you just don't see these cars like this.
No, very, very difficult, because most of them were all modified back in the day or knocked around, used for competition purposes. But yeah, this one certainly is a bit of a unicorn in that regard.
To be sitting there and have not started for 6 months and turn the key in for that car to start, it's just sitting over there idling now as we're doing this interview, and you can hardly hear a thing. That's another thing too. I don't think I've ever heard a Skyline sound like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, it stands testimony to how good that car is and how fantastic they are when they're unmolested and left in standard form.
And as you alluded to, Brad, it's an early car, 1994, as a late model classic. Still looks so good today.
It absolutely does, and certainly with the racing heritage, I think that that's going to be something which will make them appealing for many, many years to come.
So, Brad, on that note, I want to thank you so much for the invitation here to film just a couple of your cars here. It's been an interesting day, mate, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Brad.
You're more than welcome anytime. Cheers.
Well, I hope you've really enjoyed this week's episode of Classic Restos, with a big thanks to Michael Saide from Shannons, Newcastle, with his gorgeous BMW, and Brad with his invitation for us to visit his private home here to show us just some of his heritage race car collection. Well, this is the final episode, the batch filmed along the New England Highway of New South Wales. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Until next week, no matter where you're watching Classic Restos from, please ride and drive safe. I'm Fletch, and I thank you very much for watching.
You can like and follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Classic Restos TV and watch catch-up episodes at shannons.com.au.
Classic Restos is proudly brought to you by Shannons Insurance, where you can be a member of the Shannons Club. Pace Farm, the enjoyable egg. Hare and Forbes Machinery House. And Gun Lake Quarries.